has been trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government for the past 20 years for various reasons. One, Venezuela has the highest reserves of oil in the world. Two, Venezuela has taken on a leading role in the region in challenging U.S. hegemony, challenging U.S. imperialism. And three, Venezuela is socialist, and the last thing the United States wants is yet another socialist country in the Western Hemisphere. So under Trump specifically, he came in thinking that it would be easy for the U.S. to overthrow the government of Nicolás Maduro. And so immediately upon coming into office, within the first 8 months, he applied very strong sanctions against Venezuela's oil industry. Venezuela's economy runs fundamentally on oil. And so since that time, he has increased the sanctions. The sanctions have cost Venezuela over $190 billion already. And according to one UN expert, a former special rapporteur named Jose de Sayas, the sanctions have cost 100,000 Venezuelan lives. So in addition to this strategy of sanctions, Trump has also kind of imposed, or at least attempted to impose, a parallel government in Venezuela. He recognized in 2019 a man named Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela. Guaido was an elected member of the legislature. He declared himself president. Only the United States and some of its allies recognize Guaido. Most of the rest of the world continues to recognize Nicolás Maduro as the president.
Trump and Biden have very similar approaches to the Latin American country, but differ on the point of TPS, that is temporary protected status, which is to do with immigration policies. Can you explain the differences in their approach to us?
Right. So their approaches are actually very similar. So I think the main difference is that while Trump has been threatening military action against Venezuela for about 3 years now, Biden, I think he would stay away from that sort of rhetoric. But the thing is that Biden and his campaign are saying that they would build a coalition against Venezuela to force Nicolás Maduro out. But that's exactly what Trump has already attempted to do, and he's failed spectacularly. So what we anticipate for if Biden happens to win is that we're going to see more of the same against Venezuela. We're going to see the U.S. try to continue to isolate Venezuela diplomatically and economically. That said, I do think that there's a chance that Biden will get rid of some of the worst sanctions, because these sanctions by the Trump administration affect everything in terms of even the delivery of food and medicine and other humanitarian aid materials. So I think that what might be one of the key differences in their respective policies. And we've seen Biden lately, within the last month or so, talk about how sanctions sometimes can go too far. And so I think that might be the big point difference between them. But otherwise, it's going to be, the regime change attempts are going to continue. And we have to, I should really note that the sanctions actually began under the Obama administration, of which Biden, of course, was the vice president. So, their policies are very similar.
Okay, and then another difference in the approaches taken by the Republicans and the Democrats focuses on the border wall, which Trump is determined to erect between the US and Mexico, and will make use of Venezuelan funds in order to do so. If elected, how do you think that Biden will approach this issue?
Right. So it's funny because the Obama administration has actually built more walls on the border than Trump did. The difference is they did it where Trump, of course, the border wall was one of his the pillars of his campaign in 2016. He seemed to build the wall. He didn't manage to build it, but the parts he did build were actually from Venezuelan money that was stolen by the United States, basically. Money that was seized from allegedly corrupt people. There's very little transparency to see if these are actually corrupt people. There's been no trials yet. And so this money belongs to Venezuela and it's been used to build a border wall. Biden claims he did not build a border wall, but, I think, as we saw during the Obama administration, when they did it kind of surreptitiously, it's yet to be determined what Biden will do exactly. Whatever he does, I know we can expect the rhetoric to be certainly less inflammatory, but the actions will likely be very similar to Trump in this regard.
And then the United States has, on many occasions, employed interventionist tactics and dealt with the political affairs of Venezuela in a most hostile manner. How do you envision Venezuela's future to look after the US election, since neither candidate is vastly different from the other?
Well, I think Venezuela really is going to have to figure out a way to grow its economy and to provide for its people with the sanctions in place. just as Cuba has for about 60 years, just like Iran has for about 40 years or so. Because I don't think we can expect anything fundamentally to change between the Trump and Biden administrations if Biden is elected. I think we're still going to see this policy of diplomatic isolation. We're not going to see, we're not going to have relations restored between the two countries anytime soon. The policy of maximum pressure, which is what Trump calls his policy towards Venezuela, is going to more or less continue. I think the way forward for Venezuela is to really bet on the global South, to bet on its South-South relations for trade and for development, because anything to do with the United States or even Europe at this point is going to be blocked by the sanctions. And so that's not a way forward for Venezuela. The only thing they can do is develop themselves and really kind of focus internally on how they can maximize the most of what they produce, and just like, say, for example, Cuba has.
And then lastly, as waves of change sweep across the Latin American continent, as seen in the cases of Bolivia and Chile, do you think that these changes will be extended to Venezuela?
Well, no. I think part of the reason that Bolivia was able to recover its democracy, part of the reason that Chile was able to vote for this referendum they just had on Sunday, was because they saw Venezuela as an example of resisting U.S. empire, of resisting neoliberalism and capitalism. And so Venezuela, in that way, is a hope for many people in South America, in Latin America. And so I don't think anything's going to change necessarily inside Venezuela, but what will change is the geopolitics of the region, particularly next year, because we have elections coming up in Ecuador and elections coming up in Chile. And if the left wins in those two elections, we're going to see another pink tide. The pink tide refers to, an era in the early 2000s and left government after left government won in Latin America. And they created this kind of very strong regional bloc against U.S. imperialism. And I think we're going to see a reawakening of that, and we're going to see stronger ties between the left countries, and that will help that will serve as a bulwark against U.S. imperialism and U.S. aggression.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for shedding some light on the role of the United States in Venezuela and the interventionist policies it has imposed upon the country.
Thank you.
That was Leonardo Flores, a political analyst and the Latin America campaign coordinator with Code Pink, talking to us about the role of the United States in Venezuela and the foreign policy stances America has taken toward the country. And that brings us to the end of this afternoon's show. Remember that this segment can be found on our Facebook and Twitter pages. From myself, Humairaa Mayet, and